A MacKinnon girl disappears into the wild Highlands, and Hamish Macbeth is left to trace the shadows she leaves behind. What he finds is more troubling than anyone expected. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Your comments make this cozy corner feel even warmer. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next mystery. Mist had rolled down from the hills in the night, settling over Lochdubh in a long, colourless shroud that softened every outline and made the loch look like a great pewter plate left out in the cold. Hamish Macbeth walked along the shore with Lugs trotting ahead, the dog's tail lowered in a thoughtful sweep that matched the muted morning. The air tasted of damp earth and peat smoke drifting from scattered chimneys. It was a raw March morning, a bit too raw, Hamish thought, for so early in the day, and there was a stillness about it that didn't sit right with him. Lugs stopped suddenly and looked back at Hamish with a small whine. Hamish paused, pushing back a stray red curl that the wind insisted on blowing into his eyes. "What is it now?" he murmured, but the dog only sniffed the air and stared toward the harbour path, disappearing into the thick grey. Hamish followed the line of Lugs's gaze. Nothing there but mist and the faint gurgle of water slapping softly against the jetty posts. They continued on, Hamish letting the rhythm of walking carry him into that quiet part of his mind where he did his best thinking. He told himself there was nothing out of the ordinary. Still, a wee prickle worked its way under his skin. Lochdubh had moods like any village, and today it felt like someone holding their breath. Patel's shop was already open, the weak light of a single bulb casting a small circle of gold onto the wet ground outside. The bell above the door gave its familiar tinny jingle as Hamish stepped in, Lugs shaking moisture from his fur on the threshold. Inside, Mrs. Hendry and old Mr. Gillespie stood at the counter, pretending to examine the tins of shortbread, though their eyes flicked nervously toward Hamish the moment he entered. Patel nodded at him from behind the counter, expression unusually sober. "You're early," Hamish said, moving to pick up a packet of tea he didn't need. "Aye," Patel replied quietly. "Folk have been in asking after Morven MacKinnon." Hamish paused. "Morven? What about her?" Mrs. Hendry leaned in, eager despite herself. "She didn't come home last night, worked her shift at the Harbour Hotel, but never showed face after. Her mother's worried sick." Mr. Gillespie sniffed. "Probably staying with that cousin of hers in Drim. Young folk are careless." But his voice, usually full of judgment, lacked conviction. Hamish noticed the way they both avoided meeting his eyes, as though he might see too much. "When was she last seen?" Hamish asked. "Just after 10, Patel said. Left the hotel to walk up the road. Mist was thick already." Hamish paid for the tea, purely out of courtesy, and stepped back onto the wet street, the bell jingling behind him. Lugs moaned as though sharing his unease. The village looked perfectly ordinary, but the quiet felt heavier now, as though the mist had ears. He took the harbour path, the wet gravel crunching beneath his boots. A pair of gulls quarrelled noisily overhead, their harsh cries slicing through the morning hush. Lugs walked closer than usual, his body low, ears pricked forward. The Harbour Hotel sat half-shadowed by the lingering fog. A few fishing boats were tied loosely to the dock, rocking gently, their ropes creaking now and then. Hamish walked around to the back entrance, used by the staff. He knocked once, twice. No answer. It wasn't surprising. The kitchen staff would be busy with breakfast for guests. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. Warm air smelling of frying bacon and damp coats wrapped around him. The hallway was cluttered with buckets, mops and stacked crates. It looked as if someone had been interrupted mid-task. Morven's mop bucket sat full of soapy water, and her old green coat hung neatly on its hook. A pair of rubber gloves lay beside it, fingers curled like small deflated balloons. Hamish's eyes caught on a scrap of paper lying on the floor near the wall. He bent and picked it up. Half a number, could have been a phone or some supplier code, torn quickly, as though someone had meant to discard it. Nothing much to look at, but the small things were often the ones that mattered. He folded it carefully and slipped it into his pocket. No sign of Morven, no explanation for why she'd left without her coat on a cold night. He stepped into the kitchen. The hotel owner, Mrs. Forbes, was stirring porridge with brisk, anxious movements. Her face was pale under the fluorescent lights. "Oh, Hamish," she said, flustered. "If this is about Morven, I dinna ken a thing." She finished her shift, tidy as always, then said good night and left. "You're sure she left alone?" Hamish asked. "Aye, alone. She never caused bother." Mrs. Forbes paused, stirring spoons slowing. "I hope she's just visiting family." Hamish nodded politely. "If she comes round, let me know." Back outside, the drizzle had begun, a light, needling rain that felt like it had no intention of stopping. Lugs pressed against his leg, tail tucked, reluctant to walk the path that curved up toward the village. In Lochdubh, the murmur of gossip grew louder the moment Hamish appeared. Conversations died mid-sentence. A few villagers offered stiff nods, others wrung their hands. A cluster of women near the post office looked guilty simply for standing together. "Has anyone seen Morven since last night?" Hamish asked gently. No one had. No one wanted to say so either. Hamish could almost feel the village pulling inward, folding itself protectively around its own fears. He made for his station house, the small building looking even shabbier than usual under the curtain of mist. Inside, the air held the faint scent of peat smoke clinging to his jacket. He set the kettle on, rubbed Lugs' ears, and stared at the phone. He disliked phoning Strathbane at the best of times. Blair would swoop in like a buzzard, scenting opportunity, and the last thing Lochdubh needed was Blair's shouting. But a missing girl was a missing girl. He lifted the receiver, dialed the number, and waited through the long, uneven rings. "Strathbane Police? Anderson speaking. It's Hamish Macbeth. I've got a missing person here. Morven MacKinnon, young lass from the village. Didn't come home after last night's shift." A pause, then a faint snort. "Blair'll want to hear that." Of course he would. Hamish said nothing. Anderson continued. "We'll send someone up. Blair's on duty." Hamish resisted the urge to groan aloud. "Aye, fine." He hung up and let the kettle boil longer than needed. He poured himself tea, its warmth settling into his hands. Lugs lay on the floor, chin on paws, staring at the door as though expecting someone unpleasant. "Me too, boy," Hamish muttered. He stepped back outside. The drizzle had thickened, weaving the village into a curtain of soft grey. The mountains were ghosts behind the mist, and the loch rippled under a dull, metallic sheen. As Hamish walked toward the loch path again, his boots sinking slightly into the wet earth, he felt the certainty settle quietly inside him. Morven didn't simply go visiting. Something had happened, something small, human, and terrible, and Lochdubh, with all its gossip and grudges and secrets, already knew more than it wished to admit. The drizzle that had haunted Lochdubh since dawn thickened into a steady, soaking rain by the time the Strathbane police car crawled into the village like an unwelcome beetle. Hamish Macbeth stood outside his station, rain dripping steadily from the brim of his old cap, Lugs pressed against his leg with a faint, uneasy whine. The hills had vanished behind curtains of grey, and the loch rippled under the force of the falling water, darkening into something almost black. It was a morning that asked for silence, not shouting. Unfortunately, it was Blair who climbed out of the car. Detective Chief Inspector Blair arrived with his usual dramatic huff, slamming the car door so hard the vehicle shuddered in protest. Anderson followed, pale and blinking behind misted spectacles, clutching his notebook like a schoolboy, terrified of being reprimanded. Blair surveyed the village with a sneer, his coat already soaked, his thinning hair plastered down in pathetic strands. "Typical Lochdubh," he muttered loudly. "Can't he even keep track of their own folk?" Hamish kept his posture loose and mild, though he felt Lugs tense beside him. "Morning," he said quietly. "You got here quicker than expected." "Aye, because unlike some, I take missing persons seriously." Blair's eyes narrowed. "Where's this lassie? Or are ye lot planning to keep her disappearance a wee village secret, like everything else?" He didn't wait for an answer, and pushed past Hamish toward the MacKinnon house, Anderson scrambling behind him like a frightened sparrow. Hamish followed at a slower pace, the rain seeping into his old jacket. He had dealt with Blair often enough to know it was best to let the man bark himself hoarse. Inside the MacKinnon kitchen, the atmosphere felt heavy, the windows streaked with condensation, the air carrying the faint smell of yesterday's stew and today's dread. Morven's mother sat rigidly at the table, hands wrapped around a cup of tea, gone stone cold. Her eyes darted nervously from Blair to Hamish. Blair wasted no time. "When did you last see your daughter? What was she wearing? Who was she with? Did she take money? Any boyfriends? Did she run off?" The questions came like stones thrown at a window. Anderson scribbled frantically, though half of what Blair said was useless. Mrs. MacKinnon blinked, struggling to keep up. She was in her work clothes when she left. She said goodnight to me, and she went down the road. She was fine, just tired maybe. Hamish stepped forward gently, placing himself slightly between Blair and the trembling woman. "Mrs. MacKinnon," he said softly, "did Morven seem troubled lately? Anything at all?" Her eyes flickered with something that wasn't quite fear, more like shame, or a secret she wished she'd kept buried. She argued with someone at her work last week. I didn't ken the whole of it. She wouldn't say. "Who was it?" Blair demanded. "I didn't know," she cried, her voice cracking. Blair snorted. "Useless. Absolutely useless." "That's enough," Hamish said, still soft but firm enough to cut through Blair's bluster. Lugs edged closer to Mrs. MacKinnon, sensing her distress, and she reached down with a trembling hand to stroke him. The dog's presence brought a touch of warmth to a kitchen, otherwise full of cold dread. Blair rolled his eyes. "I'm heading to the loch. If she's fallen in, we'll need divers. Anderson, move." He stomped out, leaving a trail of muddy footprints and bitterness. When the door slammed shut, Mrs. MacKinnon sagged like a punctured balloon. Hamish poured her a fresh cup of tea, without asking, and set it in front of her. "He means well in his own fashion," Hamish lied gently, "but I'll be asking around quietly. Folk talk to me more easily." She managed a faint nod. "Thank ye, Hamish. Morven, she's a good lass. Too gentle for this world, her father always said." Hamish offered a small smile. "Gentlefolk can be sharp enough when needed." He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, then stepped back as Lugs nudged him toward the door. The dog was restless again, ears flicking at sounds Hamish couldn't hear. Outside, the rain had softened to a fine mist, drifting like smoke over the damp stone of the path. Blair's shouts carried faintly from the loch, accompanied by Anderson's uncertain replies. Hamish let the noise fade behind him as he made his way toward the harbour. The air smelled of seaweed and wet rope, and the wooden jetty creaked underfoot as though grousing about the weather. A lone fisherman, Tam McRae, was tying up a small boat, his cap pulled low against the mist. Tam was a man known for blunt opinions, and a talent for holding grudges longer than most marriages lasted. He eyed Hamish with suspicion, before giving a curt nod. "You're out early, Hamish." "Have to be with all this carry-on," Hamish replied. "Mind if I ask you something?" Tam shrugged, pulling his rope tighter. "If it's about Morven, I saw her." Hamish's breath caught, though he kept his tone even. "When?" "Night she vanished. She was doon here, near the pier. Talking to a man. Tall fellow, dark coat, not one o' ours. Looked like he'd swallowed a wasp, the way he was shifting his weight." Hamish pictured the scene, the mist wrapping around Morven like a shawl, her quiet voice drifting into the night. "What were they talking about?" Tam snorted. "Ye ken fine I was too far away to hear, and I'm not the type to lurk." But the lass looked uneasy. She kept wringing her hands. "Did she walk away with him?" "No, he left first. She stood there a good while after, looking like she wanted to vanish into the stones." Hamish thanked him, lingering only long enough to watch the old fisherman light a cigarette with trembling fingers. There was more in Tam's manner than he'd said aloud. Shame, perhaps, for not going to ask if the lass needed help. But Hamish didn't press. Folk in Lochdubh revealed their soft spots only in their own time. He walked slowly back toward the village, Lugs at his side. The mist lifted slightly, revealing the moor path stretching away like a pale ribbon into the hills. The sight made something inside Hamish shift uncomfortably. Outsiders rarely came to Lochdubh unless they had business, real or imagined. The tall man Tam described didn't fit, not in the easy way regular tourists fit, and not in the clumsy way lost strangers wandered through. This man had purpose, and purpose brought trouble. A gust of cold wind pushed against Hamish's jacket, flaring the edges like a warning. He rested a hand on Lugs's back, steady and familiar. "A stranger in the night, boy," he murmured. "Folk don't come to Lochdubh for the scenery alone." Lugs gave a low grumble, his gaze fixed on the moor path, as though expecting someone to emerge from the fog at any moment. Hamish stood for a long moment, the village behind him hushed, the hills ahead swallowed in grey. Something nudged at him, not quite fear, not quite certainty, but an instinct he had learned to trust. Morven had met someone that night, someone she didn't ken or didn't like, and that someone had walked away into the dark. Hamish turned back toward the village, the rain whispering at his heels. He needed to keep asking questions, quietly, carefully, before Blair frightened everyone into silence. But the image of Morven alone by the pier clung to him, a small figure swallowed by fog. Lochdubh rarely felt dangerous. But today, with the mist coiling low and the hills hidden, the village seemed uncertain of its own shape, as though waiting for something yet to be revealed. The weather changed without warning. One moment the morning lay quiet under a thin skin of mist. The next, a ragged cloud tore open above Lochdubh, letting a streak of watery sunlight fall across the village. It was not warmth, not even comfort, but a shift, one of those strange Highland moods that made the land hold its breath for a beat before settling again. Hamish Macbeth noticed it at once. Lugs had been pacing near the station door since breakfast, ears pricked forward, as though listening to distant footsteps only he could hear. "You're jumpy today," Hamish murmured, scratching the dog's head. But Lugs didn't relax. His gaze stayed fixed on the moor path leading beyond the last cluster of cottages. Then came the sharp knock. A crofter's boy stood at the doorway, face pale, water still dripping from the hem of his trousers. "Mr. Macbeth, Hamish, my Dar's dog found something. Up by the old rowan. Dar says you'd best come quick." The boy didn't need to say more. Hamish grabbed his coat, and Lugs bounded ahead, tail stiff. The moor track had turned to mud from the rain, sucking at Hamish's boots as he slogged forward. Wind whipped around them in sudden gusts, sharp as cold knives slicing down his neck. The sky had clouded over again, leaving a strange grey half-light that blurred the hills into a dull smudge. Halfway up the path, Hamish paused. The wind fell dead, as though sound itself had been swept aside. He knew what that meant, long before he saw the crofter waving frantically. The old rowan tree stood crooked against the slope, its thin branches rattling in the erratic breeze. Beneath it, slumped like a forgotten doll, lay Morven MacKinnon. For a long moment nobody spoke, even the crofter, a blunt man who rarely wasted breath on softness, stood with his hat crushed between his hands. Lugs whined, stepping carefully forward until Hamish touched his collar. Hamish knelt beside the girl. The damp earth had stained her skirt, her hair clung to her cheeks in wet strands. Her eyes were closed, but there was something wrong in the stillness. Not peaceful exactly, but resigned, as though death had surprised her gently, and she'd had no strength to resist. No signs of struggle, no torn clothing, no blood. Hamish let out a soft sigh. Oh, lass. He didn't touch her. Instead, he let his eyes travel slowly, noting without judgment. A small smear of mud streaked her sleeve, too dark, too thick for this patch of ground. A shoelace missing on her right shoe, the knot perfectly tied on the left, and beneath the faint scent of wet wool and Highland air, a whisper of something chemical, cleaning fluid from the harbour hotel. A detail, small but odd. The crofter shifted behind him. "We found her just like this. Dog wouldn't stop barking, then he whimpered, poor soul." The man rubbed his beard, eyes shiny with discomfort. "This is bad business, Hamish." Hamish only nodded. Bad business indeed. A distant engine roared up the track, far too fast for the muddy road. Hamish winced, even before Blair's voice surged across the hillside like an angry kettle boiling over. "What's all this? Murder? Obstruction? I'll not have Lochdubh making fools of Strathbane." Blair barreled toward them, red-faced and puffing, Anderson stumbling behind him with the forensic kit he didn't know how to use. Lugs growled low in his throat, but Hamish gave him a subtle pat. "You were told to call us," Blair barked, though Hamish had done exactly that. "Aye," Hamish replied mildly. "And here you are." Blair glared at the crofter. "Did you touch the body, move anything, hide anything? You folk love your secrets." The crofter stiffened. I didn't touch her. I ken better. Doubt it, Blair muttered, then turned to Anderson. Well, take notes, look official. Hamish stepped back, letting Blair throw his weight around. It gave him room to observe the gathering villagers who drifted up the path. Mrs. Hendry wringing her hands. Old Mr. Gillespie muttering over the evil fate of rowan trees. Fiona McGill with her flock of half-whispered theories already forming. Their faces held a mix of fear, guilt, sorrow, and curiosity. Lochdubh rarely saw death up close, and when it did, the village folded in on itself like a hedgehog. Hamish approached quietly. Anyone hear or see anything last night? Fiona bit her lip. I heard voices, raised ones, up the path late on. Could have been bairns causing mischief, but she glanced at Morven's still form, then away. Mrs. Hendry added, there were lights near the old fishing shed. Someone walking a boot, anyway. Thought nothing of it. Who? Hamish asked. A tall shape, she whispered. Couldn't he see the face? Hamish filed that away. The visiting birdwatcher was tall. So was the MacKinnon cousin. And Ian Rourke, the handyman with the bruises. Too many possibilities. Too many shadows in a mist-heavy night. Blair stomped toward them. You? He barked at Mrs. Hendry. If you heard something, why didn't you report it? Hiding evidence, are you? Mrs. Hendry recoiled as though slapped. Hamish stepped between them, his voice soft but firm. Leave off, Blair. Folk dinny always think he run to Strathbane at every creek in the dark. Blair opened his mouth to retort, but Anderson tugged his sleeve timidly. Sir, maybe we should, cordon the area? Blair ignored him. If this turns out to be murder, and I'm not saying it is, then someone here ken more than they're admitting. Hamish kept his tone quiet, careful. Let folk breathe, Blair. Shock does strange things. Blair glared at him. You stay out of the way. Last thing I need is your village loyalties muddling things. Then he stomped back to the body, barking useless orders. Hamish exhaled slowly, lifting his face to the shifting sky. A pale band of sunlight cut briefly through the clouds, illuminating the rowan's thin, twisted branches. In the Highlands, rowan trees were said to protect against evil. Today, the tale offered no comfort. He moved gently among the villagers again. Morven had friends, folk she confided in? Fiona shrugged. Quiet lass, kept to herself. Mrs. Hendry hesitated, then said softly, she and Sheena Grant at the hotel. They'd had words. Jealousy, maybe. Folk talk. Old Mr. Gillespie sniffed. And yon birdwatcher fellow was too friendly by half, always wandering about, asking silly questions. Another villager muttered, her cousin Alistair has a temper. Everyone ken that. Hamish absorbed it all. Loose threads, some true, some gathered from imagination. Lochdubh gossip was a strange beast, helpful, harmful, and seldom accurate. Still, gossip had a way of circling closer to truth than any Strathbane report. Lugs nosed Hamish's knee, attention fixed again on the missing shoelace. Dogs noticed things before people understood them. Hamish crouched, lightly touching the unscuffed part of Morven's shoe. It wasn't surprising for a lace to come loose, but missing altogether. Odd, little odd things mattered. Macbeth, Blair shouted. Stop crouching about like some amateur. Go check on the villagers or something. Let real police work. Hamish rose with a mild nod, feigning the incompetence Blair expected of him. Aye, sir. I'll let you get on with it. He walked away before Blair could spit more venom. The villagers parted for him, some touching his arm lightly, as though seeking reassurance. Hamish offered a faint smile, but kept his thoughts quiet. His heart felt heavy, and the weight of the damp air pressed against his chest. The mist began closing in again, swallowing the weak sunlight and turning the path back into a ghostly corridor. Hamish stood at the crest of the hill, looking down at the croft roofs, barely visible below. Lugs leaned into his leg, tail still low, eyes troubled. Poor lass, Hamish whispered. Whatever happened, we'll see her right. Lugs whined softly, as if answering. They walked the slow track back toward Lochdubh, the earth sucking at their boots with each step. The village felt subdued, watchers behind lace curtains, doors half open, in silent mourning. A crofter paused intending offence to tip his hat to Hamish, with a look that said he trusted him more than any official from Strathbane. Near the station, a stray gust carried the smell of peat smoke from the valley. Normally comforting, today it felt like a reminder of the fragility of life in these lonely hills. Hamish paused, gazing once more toward the rowan, far behind them, now hidden by mist. Something terrible had walked beside Morven in her final hours, something human, ordinary, and unremarkable, yet devastating. And somewhere in the village, someone knew more than they were saying. Hamish walked inside with Lugs at his heel. The peat fire crackled weakly, offering only token warmth. He sat for a moment, rubbing Lugs's ears, mind filled with the quiet horror of Morven's stillness beneath the rowan. Outside, the mist pressed against the windows, like a soft but persistent hand. The day had changed again. Another shift, another breath held by the Highlands. And Hamish knew, with the certainty that came from experience and instinct, that this was only the beginning. The rain eased only slightly by morning, enough for the hills to appear as murky shapes through the drifting mist. It was the sort of Highland morning that blurred edges, of land, of memory, of certainty, and Hamish Macbeth felt the weight of it as he stepped out of his station with Lugs at his heel. Damp stone glistened underfoot, and the loch lay flat and dark as a slab of slate. Somewhere far off, a sheep bleated mournfully, as though aware of the sorrow hanging over the village. Hamish pulled his coat tighter. He hated this part, the long walk through grief and rumour, knocking on doors where tea grew cold in cups and sorrow lived in the corners. But it had to be done. The girl was dead, and Lochdubh, in its quiet way, expected Hamish to look after its own. Lugs nudged his leg impatiently, eager to move. The dog sensed tension long before anyone spoke a word. Hamish began with the MacKinnon home. It felt right to show his face again, though the drizzle clung to him like burrs. Alistair MacKinnon answered the door, shoulders tense, eyes red-rimmed. He was a tall man in his 30s, with a thick crop of dark hair, and a temper that had burned bridges more than once. Today, he looked as though the wind might knock him over. "I've already told Blair all I can," Alistair said stiffly, stepping aside. "But if ye must come in—" The kitchen smelled of boiled potatoes and grief. A damp dishcloth hung over the radiator, and the air held that heavy silence of a house where someone has wept recently. Hamish spoke gently. "I won't keep you long. I only want to understand what kind of week Morven was having." Alistair's jaw tightened. She was fine. Hamish waited. People filled silence out of habit. After a moment, Alistair added, "Aye, we argued. She yammered at me about some boundary nonsense, old family rubbish. I snapped at her. Folk argue." "Did she seem frightened of anyone?" Hamish asked, softly. Alistair's gaze flicked away, too quickly. "No." Hamish noticed the man's hands, scratched across the knuckles, a small cut on his palm, fresh enough to sting. He didn't press, not yet. Lugs sniffed Alistair's boots and whimpered faintly, a soft sound Hamish knew well. Dogs smelled guilt, even when men didn't admit it. Hamish left the house with no answers, only more shadows. The rain returned in a light patter, tapping rhythmically on the hood of his coat as he and Lugs walked toward the hotel cottages. Sheena Grant lived in a small whitewashed house near the harbour. A pot of withered heather hung lopsided beside her door, and a pair of muddy wellies sat waiting on the step. When she opened the door, her eyes were puffy, hair scraped back in a bun that made her look younger than her 22 years. "Hamish," she said, startled. "Is this about Morven?" "Aye," he said. "May I come in?" Her tiny kitchen was cluttered with dishes, a sign she'd not bothered tidying since the news. A weak smell of fried onions lingered in the air. Sheena fussed with a spoon she didn't need, her movements jittery. "Folks say you and Morven had your disagreements," Hamish said gently. Sheena flushed. "Oh, that," a brittle laugh. "I just told her she acted high and mighty sometimes. She never let me forget she'd been asked to take on extra shifts. That's all it was." "You didn't like her much?" Hamish asked. "She was fine," Sheena said too quickly. "Just quiet, judgy." Her eyes flicked to Lugs, who stared at her with his usual solemn expression. Sheena looked away. "I didn't lay a finger on her, Hamish." Hamish studied her face. Guilt was there, but not the kind tied to violence. More likely envy, shame, a tangled knot of small feelings Lochdubh specialised in. He thanked her and stepped back into the rain. Next stop, the birdwatcher. Gregor Dunn had rented a cramped room above the old post office. Hamish climbed the narrow stairs, the scent of damp wood rising around him. Gregor opened the door, already mid-apology. "Oh, Inspector, no, Constable. Hamish," he stammered. "Terrible business. Dreadful. Can't imagine how a place so scenic can... Well, such tragedies," Hamish let him babble. Dunn was a short, thin man, with spectacles forever sliding down his nose, and an oddly frantic energy, like a sparrow trapped indoors. He gestured wildly toward piles of bird books scattered on the table. "I hear you spent time near the hotel," Hamish said. "Only to look for the osprey," Dunn insisted. "Magnificent creature. Morven? Oh dear, only ever said hello. Lovely girl. Quiet. So quiet." His forehead glistened with sweat despite the cold. A nervous man, but nervous men rarely committed tidy crimes. Hamish let it go. "Did you see her talking to anyone?" Hamish asked. "Not I. I keep to myself. Birds, you know. They don't judge." Hamish suspected Dunn was afraid of Blair, not guilty of anything else. Still, he made a mental note. Sometimes anxious men hid big secrets, sometimes only their nerves. Lugs sniffed the room with distaste. Hamish's next visit was the hardest. Mrs. Forbes at the Harbour Hotel. The rain had turned heavier again, the path slick with muck. Lugs' paws collected clumps of grass and dirt as they walked. The hotel loomed ahead, its windows fogged, the scent of frying kippers leaking from the kitchen vents. Mrs. Forbes met him at the back door, apron still on, face pinched. "Hamish, I've said it once. I'll say it again. Morven was like family." Lugs growled softly. Hamish noted it. Mrs. Forbes wiped her hands on her apron too often. "She left her coat here, but she must have been distracted. She was tired, poor lass." "Tired enough to go out in the cold night without a coat?" Hamish asked politely. Mrs. Forbes' lips tightened. Folk do silly things. Hamish let her ramble for a bit, watching her eyes, her hands, the shift in her breath when he mentioned Morven's recent troubles. Something flickered. Fear? Guilt? But then vanished. "Thank ye," Hamish said. "If anything comes to mind..." "Nothing will," she said quickly, before closing the door. Rain blew sideways as Hamish and Lugs walked toward the last man on his list. Ian Rourke lived in a converted shed behind the church hall, a handyman known for debts and occasional drunkenness. The shed door was slightly ajar, smelling of wet wood and turpentine. Rourke opened it halfway, eyeing Hamish with a wary gaze. "My condolences," he muttered. "You saw Morven last week," Hamish said. Rourke grunted. "Folk see folk. I had no quarrel with her." But Rourke had a bruise on his jaw, fresh, dark and uneven. Hamish noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes darted to Lugs, then away again. "Ye say ye had no quarrel? Folk say otherwise." "Folk talk rubbish," Rourke muttered. Hamish held his gaze for a long moment. Then with a soft sigh, he stepped back. "If you think of anything..." Rourke shut the door before Hamish finished. Hamish and Lugs returned to the muddy path. The wind pushed against them with insistence, as though urging them home. But Hamish wasn't done yet. He knelt briefly beside a clump of wet grass, eyes narrowing. He'd carried Morven's shoe in his memory since yesterday. The missing lace, the way the knot on the remaining one had been too neat, too new. Now he was certain. The knot hadn't been made by Morven at all. It had been replaced by someone else, someone who tried to disguise the repositioning of her body. A subtle detail, a small truth, but one that told Hamish this crime was not an accident. Lugs whined softly, as if agreeing. The last place Hamish visited was the MacKinnon home again. Alistair opened the door, face stormy. "What now?" he snapped. "Just tying loose ends," Hamish said mildly. "You think I did it?" Alistair accused, jaw trembling. "I think Morven had a hard time last week," Hamish replied carefully. "Folk argue. Folk say things they regret. If she told you anything..." "She told me nothing," Alistair shouted. "I'd never harm her." Hamish studied him. The anger seemed too sudden, too defensive, but not murderous. More like a man drowning in his own guilt over harsh words he could never take back. "Fine," Hamish said quietly. "We'll speak again." When Hamish left, the rain had stopped, but the clouds hung low, pressing against the hills like a weight. Lugs walked close to Hamish's leg, matching his slow pace. Together, they made their way back toward the loch, where the water glimmered with the muted colours of a storm yet to come. The case had grown darker, yet painfully human. Pride, jealousy, shame, small things in a small village, but enough to twist lives into knots no one could easily untangle. And the truth, Hamish knew, lay somewhere in those knots. The storm arrived before noon, rolling in from the western hills, with a force that made even the oldest roofs in Lochdubh mutter and creak. Rain swept across the village in slanted sheets, drumming fiercely against stone walls and turning every narrow path into a glistening ribbon of mud. The loch churned under the assault, waves slapping angrily against the jetty posts. It was the kind of weather that flattened colour, snuffed out cheer, and left only the raw bones of the Highlands visible. Hamish Macbeth watched it from the warmth of his station house, sitting cross-legged by the low-burning peat fire with a mug of lukewarm tea at his side. He had not bothered with paperwork. Storm days rarely encouraged bureaucracy. Instead, he stared into the fire's faint glow, thinking, not in dramatic, tortured circles, but in the quiet, practical way he always did. Morven MacKinnon, a gentle lass with a shy smile, had ended up dead under a rowan tree. There was no sense in it. No violence on her body, no theft, no sign of panic, only that odd smear of thick mud, the missing shoelace, the faint scent of cleaner. Small things, but small things mattered. Lugs lay on the hearthrug, chin resting on his paws, eyes half shut, but ears twitching at every shift of the wind. He sensed Hamish's mood, as he always did. Every so often his tail flicked uneasily, and Hamish reached down to ruffle the dog's soft fur. The telephone crackled suddenly, one angry sputter, then a long hiss of static. Hamish picked up the receiver. "Hello?" Nothing, just another storm-beaten line. He set it back gently. The storm had cut them off well enough. Outside, the wind strengthened, howling against the windows, like some ancient spirit trying to claw its way in. Even the church hall's old weather vanes screeched in complaint, its rusty hinge turning reluctantly. Hamish sighed, pulling his chair a little closer to the fire. Storm days always made him reflect more than he meant to. He felt that familiar loneliness creeping in at the edges, the kind he never admitted aloud, the kind he drowned quietly in tea and small duties. Lug's head snapped up, ears pricked toward the door. His growl started low, a rumble deep in his chest. Hamish straightened. "What is it, boy?" The dog moved closer to the door, muscles tight. A moment later, a hard knock rattled the wood. Hamish rose, stepped soft, and opened the door only halfway. A blast of cold rain struck his face, and in the middle of it stood Ian Rourke, soaked through, jacket dripping, hair plastered to his head. He clutched something in his hand. "I need to speak with ye," Rourke said, panting slightly, though the station wasn't far from his shed. "It's important." Hamish nodded and motioned him inside. Lugs stepped back reluctantly, nose wrinkling. The dog's hackles rose, though he didn't bark, just stared with sharp distrust. Rourke stood by the fire, dripping onto the rug. His hands trembled slightly as he held out an envelope. "Morven wrote me this," he said. "Got it in my door this morning. Thought you should see it." Hamish took it. The envelope was damp, edges soft, but the ink inside hadn't run. A quick job then, delivered before the full storm struck. Hamish slid out the note. The handwriting was shaky, uneven. "Ian, I cannae stay. I'm leaving Lochdubh. It's better this way. Morven." Hamish read it twice. The words felt wrong. Cannae stay? Morven had been a creature of habit and family. Leaving Lochdubh was not something she'd ever hinted at, not in her quiet talks at Patel's, not in any of her shy smiles. And the phrasing, flat, rushed, without her gentle loops, a poor imitation. "When did you find this?" Hamish asked. "This morning," Rourke said quickly, "stuck in the doorframe." Hamish watched him carefully. The man couldn't meet his gaze. His shoulders twitched in small jerks, as though trying to shake off an unseen weight. "She never said anything to ye about leaving?" Hamish asked mildly. "Nay, but she was secretive lately, distant folk change. Hamish folded the letter, slipped it back into the envelope, and set it on the table beside the peat lamp. "Aye," he said softly, "folk change." He made his tone agreeable, non-threatening, but his mind turned over each word carefully, storing them like pebbles in his pocket. Rourke cleared his throat. "Thought it might help you, that's all. I just thought you'd want to see it." "I appreciate it," Hamish said. Rourke nodded, eager to leave now that his duty was done. He shuffled toward the door. Lugs gave a low rumble, deep and uneasy. Rourke froze. "That dog hates me for no reason." Hamish scratched Lugs's head. "He's a good judge of folk," he said lightly, "though he might be reacting to something you're wearing. He's sensitive to scents." Rourke frowned, muttering something, then slipped back into the storm, pulling his collar up against the wind. Hamish closed the door slowly, then crouched beside Lugs. The dog sniffed at the air again, snorted, and pressed his nose to the rug where Rourke's coat had dripped. "What is it?" Hamish whispered. Lugs sneezed sharply and backed away. Hamish inhaled lightly. At first all he caught was damp wool and cold air. Then he smelled it. Faint, but there, industrial cleaner, the same sharp chemical tang that had clung to Morven's clothes when Hamish found her beneath the rowan tree. He stood, the pieces shifting inside his mind. Rourke had plenty of work that involved cleaning supplies, true, but the timing, the letter, the bruise on his jaw, the nervous glances, and Lugs's reaction wove together into something that didn't sit right. Hamish took the letter again, carrying it to the peat lamp. The warm amber glow illuminated the paper. He tilted it slightly, eyes narrowing. There, just barely visible, indentations beneath the shaky handwriting. Lines of a different length, different rhythm. Someone had pressed hard while writing something else, then written this false message over the top. He fetched a soft pencil, rubbing the graphite lightly across the paper. The hint of a word formed, a curve, a downward stroke. Not enough to read, but enough to prove the note hadn't begun as a farewell. "Forged," Hamish murmured. "Badly." Lugs let out a small whine, responding to the quiet tension in his voice. Outside, the wind struck the walls of the station like a fist. The rafters groaned. Hamish felt the familiar mix of worry and determination settling around him like an old coat. He wasn't frightened, just tired. Tired for the girl, tired for the village that had lost her, tired of Blair's bluster and Strathbane's cold, fluorescent halls. But he was not finished. Not with this, not with Rourke. He sat on the edge of his small bed, the storm lighting the window in pale flashes. Lugs crawled up beside him, laying his heavy head on Hamish's knee. The dog gave a soft huff, almost apologetic, as if he wished he could tell Hamish everything he'd smelled on Rourke's coat. Hamish stroked Lugs' ear, absently. "You're not wrong, boy," he said. "He's hiding something. The question is, what and why?" A gust of wind rattled the door hard enough that Lugs lifted his head again. The lamp flame flickered, casting long shadows across the room. Hamish's mind wandered back to Morven, her quiet steps, her modest smile, the way she always left the hotel kitchen spotless at night. She would never leave a half-finished shift. She would never leave her mother without word. She would never vanish into the hills alone. Somebody had tried to rewrite her ending. The storm raged, but Hamish felt a steady clarity forming beneath the noise. Someone had moved Morven's body. Someone had cleaned something nearby. Someone had gone to Rourke's shed early enough to slip a letter into the doorframe. And that same someone now wanted Hamish to believe Morven had simply run away. Hamish set the letter aside carefully. He rose, moving to the rain-streaked window. The moor beyond was a blur of grey and wind. The hills were nearly invisible. But someone was out there. Someone who had lied. And tomorrow, when the storm broke, Hamish would find them. Lugs nudged his leg once more, letting out a quiet growl, unlike any Hamish had heard from him since the death. Hamish exhaled slowly. "Aye," he whispered. "I ken. He's lying." The wind howled louder still, as though agreeing. The storm broke sometime before dawn, leaving Lochdubh washed raw and glistening under a pale, reluctant light. Low mist clung to the edges of the loch like a thin scarf, drifting in slow breaths across the water. The world smelled of wet grass, damp stone, and the faint sharpness of peat smoke trying to reassert itself after the night's battering. Hamish Macbeth stood outside his station house, one hand resting lightly on Lugs's head. The dog sniffed the morning air with quick darting movements, as though still unsettled by the storm's memory. Hamish took a sip of tea from the enamel mug warming his hands. The liquid was weak, barely more than warm water with ambition, but he drank it anyway. His mind kept circling back to Morven's forged letter, to the indentation beneath the shaky writing, and to the chemical scent on Rourke's coat. Nothing lined up properly, yet, and that meant more walking, more listening, more gentle nudging of stubborn Highland folk. The peace didn't last. The shrill ring of the station phone cut into the quiet, startling Lugs, who gave an irritated huff. Hamish sighed and stepped inside. The line crackled, the remnants of the storm affecting every word. "Macbeth," Daviot's voice blasted through, sharp as a snapped twig. "What are you doing up there? The press is sniffing around, and I've just spent half the morning dealing with some Glasgow reporter who claims a girl died on your watch." Hamish closed his eyes briefly. "The lassie died before anyone called me, sir, and Lochdubh isn't exactly courting reporters." "Don't get clever with me," Daviot barked. "Blair tells me you're dragging your feet." Of course Blair did. Hamish stared at the phone as if pondering whether to hang up. "Blair arrived yesterday and took over the scene," he said mildly. "I've only been helping where he allows it." A snort here. "Well, keep doing whatever it is you do, and keep Blair happy. I don't want Lochdubh turning into a media circus." The line went dead, leaving an annoying buzz in Hamish's ear. He set the receiver back with exaggerated care. Lugs watched him, head cocked. "Aye," Hamish muttered. "Strathbane interferes, and I'm to make them feel clever about it." Lugs let out a soft growl, which Hamish chose to interpret as agreement. Before long, the thud of a car door announced Blair's arrival. He barreled inside without knocking, coat half-buttoned, face ruddy from the cold. Anderson hovered in his shadow, scribbling, even though Blair hadn't said anything worth writing down. "Well, Macbeth," Blair began, chest puffed out, "I suppose you've heard. Daviot commended my swift response yesterday. Seems he recognises proper police work." Hamish maintained a gentle, harmless expression. "That's good, sir. Glad he saw your efforts." Blair blinked, thrown off balance by the lack of resistance. "Aye. Well, I'll be heading to the rowan tree again. There's bound to be something you missed." Anderson bobbed his head. "Yes, sir. Something he missed." Hamish held the door open for them both. "I'll have a look around myself later." Blair snorted. "Don't bother. Leave the real work to us." Hamish smiled faintly. "Aye, sir." As their tyres spat mud down the track, Hamish took his coat and whistled for Lugs, who bounded forward with eager relief. The air was thick and spongy underfoot, the ground still heavy from last night's deluge. If there were clues left at Morven's resting place, most folk would assume the storm had washed them away. Hamish didn't trust storms to be that thorough. The walk up the moor path felt strangely intimate after the chaos of yesterday. The rowan tree stood alone in the clearing, its wet branches dripping steady tears into the grass below. The earth at its base had been trampled by Blair's heavy boots and Anderson's nervous pacing, but the outskirts of the clearing, the parts Blair hadn't bothered with, still held secrets. Hamish crouched carefully, ignoring the cold dampness that soaked through his trousers. Lugs padded around the perimeter in slow, deliberate arcs, nose close to the earth. "There," Hamish murmured. A patch of mud slightly deeper, still holding its shape, despite the rain. He brushed away a thin layer of fresh silt. A boot print emerged. Not Morven's. The tread was too wide, too heavy, and the depth suggested a strong step made recently, not the night she died. "Work boots," Hamish said softly. "Size 11, maybe 12. Lugs sniffed the imprint and whined, circling it twice before pressing his nose into Hamish's palm. That small, worried gesture from the dog spoke louder than words. Hamish stood, brushing mud from his fingers. The wind tugged at his coat, carrying with it the faint scent of the loch and the sweetness of trodden grass. Someone big and strong had been here, after Morven died. Someone who knew how to move quietly. And Hamish had a very short list of men in Lochdubh who fit that description. He headed toward Patel's shop, boots sinking slightly in the softened ground. The automatic bell chimed as he stepped inside. A cluster of villagers turned as one, like birds startled from a fence, then resumed murmuring the moment they saw it was only Hamish. "Terrible business," Mrs. Hendry whispered, shaking her head. "Morven's mother's heart broken, and did you hear? Ian Rourke was seen up the moor path early on the morning she went missing." "Aye," old Mr. Gillespie added, "before sunrise. He says he was looking for scrapwood. Folk dinny look for scrapwood at 5 in the morning." Fiona McGill leaned in. "And Sheena Grant was in a state yesterday. Claims she was jealous of Morven's extra shifts, but that lass always has sharp elbows." Hamish listened quietly, hands in pockets, gaze drifting over the rows of biscuits and tinned soup. Gossip came out thick and fast, like midges after a thaw. And, like midges, most of it was more irritation than truth. But somewhere among the nonsense lived a sliver of something real. "Morven was in the library last week," Patel said at last, taking the rare step of speaking unprompted. "Took out books on local family records. Old ones. Strange choice for her." Hamish blinked. "Family records?" She was quiet about her own family. "That's why it struck me," Patel said gently. She looked nervous too, like she didn't want anyone else seeing. Hamish's mind ticked over. Morven, sweet and timid, poring over genealogies and land disputes. It didn't fit, unless she'd found something embarrassing or dangerous. He thanked them, gave Lugs a biscuit from the counter, and stepped back outside. The wind had quieted to a soft hum. The village felt smaller somehow, pressed under a heavy blanket of rain-soaked air. Hamish walked the shoreline with Lugs beside him. The loch shimmered in a muted shade of green, reflecting the low, brooding clouds. Each step felt deliberate, every sound amplified by the stillness after the storm. Bits of grass clung to his boots, and his breath fogged faintly in the cold. Morven had been looking into something old, something connected to land or family or shame. Whatever it was, it had driven someone to follow her, to confront her, to move her. The mud on his boots squelched as he paused to stare across the loch. Lugs nudged his hand, tail low, eyes soft with that doggish sadness he reserved for the darkest days. "Aye," Hamish murmured. "Something's wrong here. More wrong than folk want to say aloud." A distant gull cried, sharp and lonely. Hamish tightened his coat against the breeze and turned back toward the village. Tomorrow, he'd start asking different questions. The next morning dawned with a thin braid of mist, twisting low across the loch, drifting in slow, thoughtful folds, as though the water itself were hesitating to reveal its secrets. Hamish Macbeth walked along the shore, with Lugs padding beside him, the dog's paws leaving faint tracks on the damp stones. The air carried that clean, sharp smell of a night wind, having washed everything bare. It was the kind of Highland morning that felt both gentle and solemn, like the land was offering a quiet apology for yesterday's hardships. Hamish needed the walk. Thinking came easier when the world was muffled by mist, and the only sounds were the soft clink of water against the rocks and Lugs' steady breathing. The clue Patel had shared about Morven's sudden interest in family records nagged at him. It didn't fit with a girl who, by all accounts, had lived a life small in radius and steady in rhythm. Looking into genealogy wasn't a hobby taken up lightly. It meant she was searching for something, or someone. A gust of wind tugged at his coat. Lugs stopped abruptly, nose lifted toward the library hill. Hamish gave a faint nod. "Aye, boy, we'll go that way." The village library sat in an old stone house converted decades ago, its windows fogged slightly from the early morning fire that Mrs. Fraser, the librarian, stubbornly kept burning even in April. When Hamish pushed open the heavy door, the scent of peat smoke mingled with the smell of old paper and polish. Mrs. Fraser looked up from behind the counter, spectacles perched on the end of her thin nose. "Hamish Macbeth," she said softly. "I wondered when you'd wander in. Everyone's talking about poor Morven." Hamish removed his dripping cap. "I heard she was in here last week. Settle a question or two for me." Mrs. Fraser folded her hands. Her movements were slow, almost ceremonial, as though the topic itself required delicacy. "Aye, she came in twice, actually. Borrowed the MacKinnon family records. Very old things. Dusty as midges in August." "What was she looking for?" Hamish asked. Mrs. Fraser shook her head. She didn't say, just asked about boundaries and croft lines, old disputes, the kind folk didn't mention these days, except in hushed tones. She paused, eyes narrowing with thought. She seemed conflicted, like she'd discovered something she didn't want to know. Hamish felt that faint tug of intuition, a family matter, something Alistair had tried to laugh away, something that had lodged itself under Morven's skin. Did she seem frightened? He asked gently. No, Mrs. Fraser said. Troubled, aye, but not frightened. Morven was a kind lass, sensitive. She wouldn't harm a fly, but she would fret herself sore over another's quarrel. Hamish thanked her and stepped back outside. The air felt colder now, sharper. Lugs walked close to his leg, sensing the shift in Hamish's mood. Aye, Hamish murmured. Time to speak with her cousin again. The croft lay a short hike beyond the village edge, where the land began its slow climb toward the heather-strewn hills. The wind whipped harder here, pushing the grass flat against the earth in small waves. Alistair MacKinnon stood near a broken fence post, wrestling with wire, while a few disinterested sheep bleated behind him. He straightened when he saw Hamish approaching. His expression hardened, though a flicker of guilt, or exhaustion, crossed his eyes. If you're here to accuse me again, Alistair said, ye can turn back now. Hamish shook his head. Not accusing, just needing the truth. Alistair's jaw worked. He set down the coil of wire and rubbed a hand across his face. The wind made his hair whip wildly around his forehead. We argued, he admitted finally, shoulders slumping. Not because I meant harm. Morven accused me of lying about an old boundary. Some nonsense about great-grandad, claiming more croft than he should have. Old ghosts, Hamish, nothing more. And was she right? Hamish asked, quietly. Alistair hesitated. That tiny pause told Hamish everything. Aye, the man muttered, but it was generations ago. No one cares now. Morven cared, Hamish said gently. Aye, she cared too much. Alistair's eyes glistened. She wanted to tell her mother, set the record straight. I was angry, aye, but only for shame, not rage. Hamish studied the man's posture, the tremor in his voice, the honest misery in the set of his mouth. This was a man trapped by pride and old family stories, not murder. Lugs sniffed Alistair's boots, then turned away with no more than mild interest. Hamish took that as confirmation. Thank ye, Hamish said softly. I believe ye. Alistair sagged in relief, though shame still hung over him like a worn coat. Hamish left him with his sheep and his wind-scoured regrets. Back in the village, the first feeble sunbreak shone briefly through the clouds, glistening on the wet roofs of Lochdubh. Hamish headed for the old post office building, where Gregor Dunn, the birdwatcher, had rented a room. The place was already locked up, curtains drawn back neatly. A neighbour sweeping her walkway called out, He left early yesterday morning, taxi to Inverness. Hamish walked to the Harbour Hotel and rang the desk. Gregor Dunn, the birdwatcher, did he check out? Aye, Hamish, said Mrs. Forbes, voice clipped, paid his bill, then went on about the osprey again. Any trouble from him? Only constipation, she said dryly. The man ate like a starved otter. Hamish cracked a faint, reluctant smile. Dunn, overeager, awkward and sweat-prone, was not their man. He filed the thought away and returned to the road, Lugs trotting beside him. The wind had begun to rise again, carrying the smell of seaweed from the harbour. As Hamish walked, his eye caught something fluttering near the ground by the hotel side door, a scrap of paper, weather softened. He picked it up, then realised with a jolt of recognition that it matched the scrap already in his pocket. The same thin paper, the same ink smudge. He held it up to the light, not just a random number after all, but a supplier code, repeated on every slip. Of course, Hamish murmured. A nothing clue. Morven hadn't torn it in fear or haste. She'd simply dropped it at work. One more red herring dissolved. Wind swept a strand of hair across his eyes. Lugs nudged his hand, sensing his shifting focus. Together they walked the length of the harbour path, past creaking jetties and fishing boats, whose ropes groaned softly under the pull of the tide. A gull swooped overhead, crying sharply, as though scolding the world for its carelessness. Hamish slowed his steps as he returned to the moor path where Morven had been found. Even from a distance, the rowan tree stood like a lone sentinel, its thin branches trembling in the restless breeze. The grass around it had dried slightly, though the earth still held the memory of yesterday's storms. He crouched near the base of the slope. The footprints he had seen earlier, heavy, deep, moving in a pattern that suggested exertion, not wandering, remained in faint outline. Someone had carried Morven, not guided her, not argued with her, carried her. That took strength and guilt. Hamish rose slowly, gaze drifting over the moor, the hills, the dipping curve of the village path below. The red herrings were falling away one by one, leaving something stark and necessary behind. Morven hadn't died alone, and whoever had moved her body had done so with the trembling desperation of someone hoping nature might erase their mistake. The loch shimmered dully as the wind stirred its surface. Hamish walked slowly toward it, lugs matching his pace, their shadows stretching across the damp grass. The faint scent of sorrow lingered in the air, something that clung like mist, refusing to lift. Hamish paused at the water's edge. A soft ripple broke against the stones. "Aye, boy," he whispered. "It's narrowing now." Lugs pressed his head against Hamish's hand. Tomorrow would bring harder questions. The morning settled damp and heavy over Lochdubh, the kind of stillness that came after a storm, but offered no peace. Mist hovered low, sliding in pale drifts across the harbour like breath from some slumbering creature. Hamish Macbeth walked the narrow waterfront path, with Lugs trotting close at his heel, the dog's nose twitching at every salt-tinged breeze. The fishing boats creaked in their moorings, their ropes swollen with rain, and the jetties let out soft wooden groans as the tide shifted beneath them. Hamish paused a moment to look at the loch. Its surface was dark, glassy, reflecting the dull sky. A thin shiver of wind rippled across it, carrying the faint scent of diesel and seaweed. He pulled his coat tighter. Thoughts churned inside him, slow, steady, as if shaped by the rhythm of the water. The red herrings had fallen away. What remained was small, human, and close to home, and every thread pointed back to the harbour hotel. Mrs. Forbes had been tight-lipped since the start, but Hamish knew people eventually talked if given the right silence. Lugs nudged him, urging him onward. A gull screamed overhead, scattering droplets of mist from its wings as it passed. The hotel loomed near the water, its white walls stained darker at the bottom, where the rain had soaked in. Hamish stepped through the back entrance, the familiar scent of dish soap and frying bacon wrapping around him. The kitchen staff nodded awkwardly. A few avoided his eyes. Gossip ran like a cold undercurrent through the room. Mrs. Forbes emerged from the pantry, clutching a clipboard to her chest as though it were armour. "Oh, Hamish," she said, too quickly, too brightly. "I'm awfully busy this morning. Supplies to check, guests coming later. Best make it quick." Hamish didn't answer. He removed his cap and sat at the small table near the corner, folding his long frame into the chair with the patient ease of a man fully prepared to wait. Lugs lay beside him, chin on paws but eyes sharp. Mrs. Forbes hovered by the counter, clipboard still clutched, her fingers tapping against the wood. "You've asked everything already," she said, her voice tightening. "The girl left. I told you." Hamish remained silent. Mrs. Forbes shifted. "There's nothing more to add." Still nothing from Hamish. She let out a thin breath. Hamish, really? He met her gaze with a quiet, steady look that was neither accusing nor gentle, just present. Hamish had learned long ago that silence in Lochdubh was not absence, but invitation. And Mrs. Forbes, for all her sternness, was not immune to loneliness. Her shoulders sank first, then her grip on the clipboard slackened. She set it down on the counter with a soft thud and pressed the heel of her hand to her forehead. "Fine," she whispered. "Fine." She was crying. Hamish didn't move. He simply softened his posture by a degree, letting the air grow warmer. Mrs. Forbes swallowed. "In the linen cupboard. 3 days before all this." She bit her lip. "I heard her sobbing. I asked what was wrong, but she just shook her head. Said she'd made a mistake, that she didn't mean to get him in trouble." Hamish felt Lugs's ears flick. "Who?" Hamish asked, softly. "I don't know." Mrs. Forbes wrung her hands. "She didn't say, but she was frightened. Not of me, just of something she'd seen, something she shouldn't have. Hamish's mind began stitching these small pieces together. Mistakes, trouble, something at the hotel, something involving a man, someone she didn't want to expose. Mrs. Forbes picked up the clipboard again, gripping it like a lifeline. I thought maybe she'd argued with Ian Rourke again. He's been drinking more than usual, short-tempered lately. She told him off once, said he should mind himself better. He snapped at her for sticking her nose in. I separated them. Hamish lowered his gaze. I see. Mrs. Forbes reached for the kettle out of habit, but her hands trembled too much to lift it. Hamish, I didn't want to accuse anyone. Folk in this village remember every word you say. Twist it into something ugly. I just wanted peace. Hamish nodded slowly. Peace can be costly. A silence settled, gentle at first, then waited. Lugs rose suddenly, nose lifted, tail stiff. He moved toward the hall, sniffing the air, with purposeful urgency. Lugs? Hamish murmured, following. The dog padded down the corridor, where the hotel's workers stored their supplies. The door to the storage shed outside was propped open slightly, letting in a draught of damp salt air. Lugs pushed through it without hesitation, barking once, low and insistent. Hamish stepped into the shed. The scent of bleach and industrial cleaner hit him immediately. Metal shelves lined the walls, stocked with mop heads, detergent bottles, rubber gloves. A faint flicker of fluorescent light buzzed above, giving the room a harsh, cold sheen. Lugs moved toward the far corner, nose pressed close to the floor. Hamish crouched beside him. There, half hidden beneath a crate of cleaning rags, was a boot print. Heavy, deep, wide hidsa. Hamish exhaled. The same tread pattern he'd seen by the rowan tree. He straightened slowly, the shed's dim light casting thin shadows across his face. Mrs. Forbes appeared at the doorway with a startled look. What is it? She asked, breath catching when she saw him examining the floor. You keep cleaning supplies here? Hamish asked lightly. Aye, of course. Staff use them for the rooms. Her gaze darted nervously to the boot print, then away. Ian works out of here too, fixing things, shifting crates. Hamish walked past her gently, Lugs following closely. When did you last see him? Mrs. Forbes twisted her fingers together. Yesterday morning. He came in late, looked rough, said he'd been clearing his head on the moor. Before sunrise? Hamish asked. Her silence answered for her. The mist outside had thickened again, swallowing the harbour in soft grey folds. Hamish stepped into it, letting the damp air cool his thoughts. He walked a slow path toward the loch, Lugs trotting close, still alert. He hadn't yet reached the water when Mrs. Forbes hurried after him, her voice small and fraying. Hamish, I didn't want to believe he might have been involved. Ian's a difficult man, but not wicked. Hamish turned gently. Folk do desperate things when their shame grows bigger than their sense. Mrs. Forbes lowered her gaze, arms wrapped around herself against the cold. Thank you for telling me, Hamish said softly. And he meant it. In Lochdubh, honesty wasn't given freely. It was earned by patience. Rain began to fall again, small sharp drops pattering lightly on his shoulders, smudging the mist into moving shapes. Lugs shook himself, spraying droplets into the air. Hamish walked toward the curve of the loch, hands deep in his pockets. His mind sifted through everything. Morven's quiet shame, her crying in the cupboard, Rourke's angry muttering, the scent of cleaner on his jacket, the heavy footprints beneath the rowan tree. Piece by piece the image formed. Morven had seen something small but dangerous. Not wicked, but enough to frighten someone who already lived close to the edge. A man with debts, a man who drank, a man too proud to be reported. Lugs pressed his head against Hamish's hand, offering silent comfort as they walked. The rain grew steadier, the loch darker, the wind colder. Hamish's steps slowed as he looked out over the water. Bit by bit the pieces were falling into place, and tomorrow he would start pulling on the thread that tied them all together. A thick, colourless fog drifted over the moor in slow rolling breaths, softening the sharpness of the heather and swallowing the land in a pale, wavering shroud. It was the kind of Highland fog that erased distance, leaving only shapes, blunted, ghost-like, and the small sounds close to one's own boots. Hamish Macbeth walked steadily along the narrow track, his long frame cutting a faint path through the white. Lugs padded beside him, his outline barely visible, except for the occasional flicker of his ears or the soft jingle of his collar. The air tasted damp and metallic, prickling against Hamish's cheeks. He breathed in the scent of peat and cold stone, grounding himself, as he always did on these solitary walks. Thinking on the moor was easier. Decisions felt slower, more deliberate, shaped by the steadiness of the land. Today, his thoughts circled one man. The converted shed behind the church hall sat on a slight rise, the shape of it just beginning to emerge through the fog, crooked roofline, chimney leaning slightly like a tired shoulder. Hamish slowed his pace, listening. A faint scraping sound met his ears. A knife against wood. Rourke. Lugs paused, head low, sniffing the wind with a seriousness that made Hamish rest a hand on the dog's back. "Aye, boy," he murmured. "We're near." As they approached, Rourke came into view. He sat on a small worn stool outside the shed. Hunched over a piece of driftwood, he was carving into something shapeless. His shoulders looked heavier than usual, pulled down by more than weather. His eyes, bloodshot and rimmed with exhaustion, lifted when he sensed movement. "Macbeth," he said, voice flat, then wary. "You've come early." Hamish said nothing at first. He stepped closer, Lugs sitting at his side, watchful. Rourke's knife hesitated above the wood. "If you're here to blame me again, you'll find I'm not in the mood." Hamish lowered himself onto an overturned crate, letting the quiet settle between them. Mist curled around the bothy door, muffling the world. "I got your letter," Hamish said simply. Rourke stiffened. "I told you Morven wrote it." Hamish's tone remained mild. "Did she now?" Rourke's jaw tightened. His hands gripped the small carving until his knuckles whitened. "I found it in my doorframe." "And she left it there herself?" Hamish asked softly. A long, brittle silence answered him. Rourke swallowed, Adam's apple bobbing visibly. "I didn't mean for any of it." The words cracked. The knife slipped from his fingers and clattered against the stone. Hamish waited, saying nothing. He'd learned long ago that guilt loosened its hold when air and patience pressed against it. Rourke hunched forward, elbows on knees, face buried in his hands. "She saw me," he whispered. "Thieving. Stealing from the hotel supplies. I was selling things to a man in Strathbane, just to keep afloat. I didn't have much, Hamish. The repairs, the drink, I got myself in a hole." Hamish felt Lugs shift closer, sensing the tension. "She confronted me in the shed," Rourke went on. "Told me to stop, said she'd have to tell Mrs. Forbes if I kept on. She was trembling, Hamish, like she didn't want to say it, but she was right." The fog thickened around them, muffling even the wind. "We argued," Rourke said, voice cracking more fully now. "I grabbed her arm, not hard, just to make her listen, but she pulled away, stepped on the wet floor." His breath shuddered. "She slipped, hit her head on the crate. One moment she was upright, next moment she was quiet." Hamish's throat tightened. He kept his voice even. "You checked for breath?" "I tried," Rourke said, shaking. "She was gone. Just gone. And I panicked. I've made mistakes before, but never this." Tears clung to his lashes. "I thought if folk saw her on the moor, they'd think she wandered home and fell. I carried her, set her under the tree. I thought the rain would wash the rest." Hamish felt a deep ache settle behind his ribs. Not anger, just sorrow for the brokenness of ordinary lives, pushed too far. "She deserved better," Hamish said quietly. Rourke nodded helplessly. "I know. God help me, I know." For a long moment there was only the fog, the faint heather scent, and the sound of Lugs breathing. Hamish rose slowly. "Ian," he said, gentle but firm, "it's time to come with me." Rourke didn't move at first, but then, with a broken exhale, he stood. His shoulders sagged like a man walking into winter. They began down the path together, Hamish, Rourke and Lugs. The fog seemed to part reluctantly, revealing slick patches of grass glistening with moisture. Rourke walked with uneven steps, each footfall heavy. Halfway down a slope, Hamish stepped on a hidden patch of wet moss. His long legs slid, and his balance lurched. The ground dipped sharply to the right, and for a heartbeat he felt weightless, dangerously so. Like a man on the brink of tumbling into bracken and stone, Lugs barked sharply. Rourke's hand shot out with reflexive speed, gripping Hamish's arm and hauling him upright. They stood together in the mist, breath unsteady. "Careful, Macbeth," Rourke muttered, voice rough. Hamish gave a small, wry breath. "Aye, thank ye." A strange mercy in the bleakness. They resumed walking. The moor path stretched ahead, faint and wavering under the fog. Rourke's confession hung between them like a damp weight, but there was a steadiness to his steps now, resignation perhaps, or relief. As they neared the curve leading back toward Lochdubh, the fog began to thin. The faint silhouette of the village appeared. Chimneys, rooftops, the faint ribbon of smoke rising from Patel's shop. Rourke stopped for a moment, staring. "I never meant for her to die, Hamish." "I believe ye," Hamish said softly, "but you'll answer for what came after." Rourke nodded once, shoulders bowed. Lugs pressed close to Hamish's leg, sensing the shift toward finality. Together they walked into the clearing light, leaving the moor behind them, its secrets slowly fading back into mist, waiting for the wind to carry them away. The fog had returned by the time Hamish and Rourke reached the edge of Lochdubh, a soft, swirling veil rolling in from the loch and creeping between the cottages. It wrapped the village in muted greys, dimming sound and softening movement, as though Lochdubh itself wished to hush the morning. Rourke walked with his head bowed, hands thrust deep in his pockets, each step slow and resigned. Lugs trotted at Hamish's side, glancing back now and then, as if making sure the man behind them wasn't planning to bolt. The closer they came to the village square, the more voices drifted on the cool air. Low murmurs, sharp whispers, feet shifting uneasily on damp pavement. Word travelled quickly here, faster sometimes than breath. Blair arrived first. His car squealed to a stop, mud splashing onto the grass verge. He stepped out with the puffed chest and gleaming eyes of a man who believed destiny had finally noticed him. Anderson scrambled behind him like a lanky shadow, clutching a notebook he didn't know how to use. "Well, well," Blair announced, loudly enough for the gulls to hear. "What do we have here? Macbeth finally doing his job?" Hamish didn't rise to it. He stood calmly, one hand resting on Lugs's head. Rourke stared at the ground, shoulders tight. "I believe Ian here wishes to make a statement," Hamish said mildly. "A statement?" Blair crowed, stepping forward. "More like a confession. And I must say, Macbeth, I always suspected him." He jabbed a thumb at Anderson. "Didn't I say so?" "I said so." Anderson nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, sir. You said so many times." Blair smirked, basking in invisible applause. A few reporters, fresh off the Strathbane bus, clustered near the square, cameras dangling, notebooks open. The scent of cheap aftershave and ink clashed against Lochdubh's clean morning air. "A word, Inspector Blair?" one of them called. Blair lifted his chin, smoothing a stray hair back into place. "Certainly. I've led a very thorough investigation." Hamish resisted the urge to sigh. He tilted his head to Rourke. "Come on, let's go inside." Rourke nodded faintly, grateful for the escape from Blair's booming voice. Hamish guided him into the station, closing the door softly behind them. The fog outside muffled Blair mid-sentence, turning his loud proclamations into vague, distant noise. Inside, the station felt quiet and oddly intimate. The peat fire in the corner gave off a faint warmth, and Lugs settled near it with a soft grunt. Rourke lowered himself into the wooden chair opposite Hamish's desk. His face looked older this morning, creased with regret, eyes hollowed by sleeplessness. Hamish wrote the essentials, nothing more. Rourke spoke in a low, tired voice, explaining everything again, step by step. Hamish didn't prod where prodding would only dig wounds deeper. He never included shame in his reports, never wrote down moments that would serve no justice and only humiliate. When the statement was finished, Hamish set down his pen. "Thank ye," he said quietly. Rourke swallowed. Is Mrs. MacKinnon "I'll speak to her," Hamish said. "Nobody needs the details that will only help them heal." A tear slid down Rourke's cheek. He wiped it away with the back of his hand, ashamed. "She was a sweet lass, Hamish. I never meant—" "I ken," Hamish said gently. Come on. Blair will be wanting the glory of escorting you to Strathbane. Rourke winced but stood. Hamish led him outside. Blair was still speaking to the reporters, waving his hands grandly. Of course, I followed the evidence. I put the pressure on the suspect, and he cracked, as they always do. Good policing, you see. Solid Strathbane-style detective work. When Blair saw Rourke, he straightened his coat importantly. There he is, the man I identified early in the investigation. Hamish kept a straight face. Inspector, here's Ian. He's ready to go with you. Blair clapped his hands once. Excellent, Anderson, cuff him. Anderson fumbled with the handcuffs, like someone wrestling with a metal puzzle. When he finally managed to secure Rourke's wrists, Blair smiled proudly at the cameras. Just another case cracked under my leadership, he proclaimed. Macbeth helped, of course, in minor ways. Minor ways. Lugs gave a disgruntled growl under his breath. The reporters scribbled, a few taking photos. One glanced curiously at Hamish, but he remained in the background, just as he preferred. Let Blair have his glory. It cost Hamish nothing. Blair ushered Rourke into the back of the squad car. Drive safe, Hamish murmured quietly to the man through the window. Rourke nodded, eyes heavy with a sad acceptance. As the car drove away, the fog swallowed the tail lights until only a faint glow remained, then nothing. A soft murmur rose behind Hamish. Villagers had gathered outside Patel's. Mrs. Hendry, old Mr. Gillespie, the Curry sisters, wrapped in tartan shawls, young Fiona McGill still wiping flour from her apron. Their voices overlapped like gentle waves, relief, sorrow, regret, speculation, and forgiveness threading together into the familiar rhythm of Lochdubh gossip. That poor lass, Mrs. Hendry whispered. At least Hamish sorted it, Mr. Gillespie said, tipping his cap toward him. Aye, murmured Fiona. He always does. Nobody thanked Blair. Hamish gave them a nod, soft and unassuming, then turned back inside the station. Paperwork waited, though he dreaded it more than fog or rain or Blair. He sat at his desk, pen moving slowly across the page. He wrote only what mattered. No mention of Morven's tears, no mention of Rourke's trembling hands, no mention of the piece of mercy that pulled him back from the slick slope. Those were not for Strathbane's cold fluorescent lamps. Those belonged here, in Lochdubh, where human frailty was understood without being weaponized. By the time he finished, afternoon had bled into evening. The fog thickened again, drifting across the loch like a quiet tide. Lugs nudged his leg once, twice, gentle, insistent. Hamish rose, stretching his long limbs. Aye, boy, time to head home. They stepped outside. The air was cool, smelling of damp grass and faint peat. Lamps flickered to life in cottage windows. The village exhaled, settling into its evening rhythm. Hamish walked slowly along the shore path, his boots making soft sounds on the wet earth. Lugs pressed close, sensing his tiredness the way only the loyal dog could. A curl of melancholy tugged at Hamish, light, familiar, almost comforting. A good lass was gone, a troubled man was facing justice, and Lochdubh, with all its stubborn kindness and quiet griefs, had begun to knit itself back together. The mist parted just enough to reveal the water, dark and shimmering. Hamish breathed in deeply. Tomorrow would be quieter, but tonight belonged to soft fog, a loyal dog, and the steady comfort of Lochdubh's gentle, weather-beaten heart. The morning settled over Lochdubh in a quiet, grey hush, the kind of stillness that felt almost respectful. Mist drifted low across the village roofs, softening the chimneys into blurred shapes. The loch lay flat and dull as old pewter, showing no ripples except where a lone gull skimmed its surface. Hamish Macbeth walked slowly up the narrow lane toward the MacKinnon cottage, Lugs close at his side, paws brushing against wet heather. The air smelled faintly of peat smoke and damp wool, the familiar scents of a village holding its breath. Hamish paused outside the cottage gate. The small front garden, which Morven had tended with shy diligence, looked weary from the recent rains. Mud streaked the stepping stones, and a pot of winter pansies drooped at one corner, their colours dulled. Lugs waited beside him, tail still, sensing Hamish's hesitation. Inside, Mrs. MacKinnon sat at her kitchen table, hands folded neatly in her lap. She was a thin woman, with gentle eyes that looked older than the rest of her face. A kettle hissed softly on the stove, the steam fogging the small window above the sink. When Hamish entered, she didn't stand. She simply nodded toward the empty chair across from her. "Sit, Hamish," she said, voice quiet but steady. Hamish removed his cap and obeyed. Lugs settled on the floor beside him, curling his tail close. Mrs. MacKinnon looked at him directly, without flinching. "Ye've found the truth, then?" Hamish nodded. "Aye." Rourke confessed. It wasn't deliberate. Morven slipped. He panicked. He delivered the facts gently, plainly, without embellishment. There was no comfort in the details, and no need to twist them. Mrs. MacKinnon listened, hands motionless on the table. When he finished, she exhaled slowly, pressing a hand against her chest, as though easing a stitch of pain. "I thought as much," she whispered. "My Morven, she wouldn't provoke anyone, but she cared too much, always did." Hamish lowered his gaze. She was trying to help. She saw something she meant to set right. "Aye." Mrs. MacKinnon looked at the kettle, though she made no move to pour the tea. "Folk think goodness protects a person. It doesn't. It only leaves them exposed." She shook her head slightly, but no tears came. Only a worn, tired sadness, like someone who had known grief before and would know it again. "Thank ye, Hamish," she said at last, "for bringing the truth, for being kind with it." He felt heat rise to his face, not from pride but embarrassment. He wasn't accustomed to gratitude. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "Aye," she said softly. "So am I." He stood unsure whether to offer comfort, knowing words wouldn't help. Mrs. MacKinnon reached out and briefly touched his sleeve. It was enough. Hamish nodded, tipped his cap, and stepped back into the mist. The lane felt narrower on the way out. The village still held that muted quiet, as though even the crows on the wires understood something solemn had passed through. Hamish walked toward the moor path without thinking. Lugs trotted ahead, looking back now and then to make sure Hamish was following. The moor welcomed them with its usual rough tenderness. Stretched hills, damp earth, patches of yellowing heather stubbornly clinging to colour. Mist curled around Hamish's legs as he walked. His boots sank slightly into the soft ground, making little sucking sounds. He let his thoughts drift the way they naturally did during these long solitary walks. He didn't think of the crime. That part was finished, resolved in the world's eyes, if not entirely in his own. Instead, his mind wandered toward quieter things, the loneliness that threaded itself through Highland life, the small tragedies that came not with violence but with ordinary missteps, heavy sorrows, moments folk wished they could undo. Morven had been a gentle lass, one of the countless souls in Lochdubh who slipped through life without fuss. Her death wouldn't echo loudly outside the village, but it left a hollow place all the same. Lugs raced ahead briefly, then circled back, nose nudging Hamish's hand. Hamish stroked the dog's ear, grateful for the wordless company. "Aye, boy," he said quietly. "Life goes on, whether we're ready or not." They walked until the mist thinned and the sky stretched wider. A faint breeze slipped over the hill, carrying the scent of damp grass. The rough cry of a distant sheep floated toward them. It was enough to bring Hamish back from his wandering thoughts. By the time he returned to the village, the square had grown livelier. The fog had lifted in patches, revealing small groups of villagers speaking in soft tones. Not gossip now, but something gentler, remembering Morven, wondering aloud how her mother would cope, tucking grief into community as Highland folk did best. The Harbour Hotel caught Hamish's eye. Mrs. Forbes stood near the back door, speaking with a delivery man. When she spotted Hamish, she dismissed the man with a nod and approached, wiping her hands on her apron. "Hamish," she said, stopping a little too abruptly. "I heard about Rourke." Hamish nodded, waiting. Mrs. Forbes looked down at her hands. "You handled it well. You always do. Quietly. Kindly. Some men wouldn't have bothered." Her voice cracked slightly, though she smoothed it quickly. "Thank ye." Hamish felt heat rise in his ears. "Just doing my job." "Maybe," she said, "but you do it with decency. Folks see that." Hamish cleared his throat, uncomfortable. Compliments always felt like borrowed coats, useful but never fitting right. "Anyone else need speaking with?" he asked. "No," Mrs. Forbes said with a small smile. "Folk are settling. They'll manage." Hamish nodded and stepped back, letting her return to her work. On the far side of the square, two tourists climbed out of a small car, squinting up at the hotel sign. They carried bright jackets and cheerful expressions, city folk arriving for the early spring season, unaware of the winter the village had just weathered. Their voices bounced lightly in the air as they discussed sightseeing and fresh seafood. Life, Hamish thought, had a stubborn way of moving forward, even when hearts lagged behind. A soft rain began to fall again, gentle and steady, dotting the stone path with dark speckles. Lugs shook his fur and pressed against Hamish's leg, urging him toward home. Hamish didn't resist. He let the afternoon drizzle settle around him like a thin shawl. The day felt quiet, softened by reflection rather than sorrow. Morven's life had been small but meaningful, and her death had reminded the village of its own fragile threads. He walked toward his cottage with Lugs leading, tail swaying gently. Smoke rose from nearby chimneys. The loch shimmered faintly beneath the soft rain. Tomorrow would be different, perhaps brighter, perhaps not. But tonight, Lochdubh breathed slowly again. Night eased itself slowly over Lochdubh, not in any grand or dramatic way, but with the familiar softness of a worn woolen blanket pulled gently across tired shoulders. A thin drizzle whispered against the station windows, each drop tapping a small steady rhythm. The lamplight inside flickered faintly, throwing quiet shapes across the walls. Hamish Macbeth sat beside his peat fire, long legs stretched out, bootlaces undone. The flames glowed low and steady, giving off that comforting scent of warm earth and smoke that always made the station feel more like home than any other place he had known. The paperwork for the MacKinnon case lay half-finished on his small desk, ink drying unevenly where he had stopped bothering to correct his handwriting. Reports, statements, Daviot's pointless instructions, all edged toward the corner of the desk like unwanted dinner guests. Hamish glanced at them now and then, but they held no urgency anymore. The worst of it was over. Justice, such as it was in a place like this, had been served. Lugs lay curled at Hamish's feet, the dog's soft huffs rising and falling with each calm breath. Every so often, his tail thumped lightly against the rug, as though reassuring Hamish he was still awake, still keeping watch. Hamish leaned back in his chair, mug of tea cooling on the table beside him. The steam had long faded. He lifted it for a sip anyway, grimaced, then set it back down. "Ugh," he muttered under his breath. "Cold again." Outside, the drizzle deepened, brushing against the window in soft, patient strokes. No storm, no wind, just a Highland drizzle, persistent enough to be noticed, gentle enough to soothe. Somewhere in the distance, a sheep bleated once, offended by nothing in particular. Hamish stared into the fire. His thoughts drifted, not sharply, not painfully, just in that quiet, wandering way they did at the end of a hard case. Morven MacKinnon's face rose briefly in his mind's eye. The shyness, the lowered gaze, the way she'd always tried to avoid taking up too much space. A simple lass with simple hopes. Gone now, through no malice of her own. He rubbed a hand across his jaw, feeling the familiar prickle of stubble. "Poor lass," he said softly, not to Lugs, not to anyone in particular, just to the room, to the fire, to the lingering sadness that hung in the air like mist over the loch. He wondered, fleetingly, whether Priscilla had heard the news. Word travelled fast through Sutherland, faster still through her circle of polite, polished acquaintances. Perhaps she knew already. Perhaps she would call. But Hamish made no move toward the telephone. That world, her world, felt too tidy, too far away from the peat smoke warmth of Lochdubh, and he knew how that world viewed grief, neatly, politely, at a distance. He was not in the mood for polished sadness. Lugs stirred, lifting his head to nudge Hamish's ankle. Hamish reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears. Lugs leaned into the touch, letting out a contented sigh that melted a little of the heaviness in Hamish's chest. "Aye, we did what we could, boy," Hamish murmured. and no more can be asked. Lugs closed his eyes again, satisfied. Hamish let his hand rest on the dog's warm fur for a long moment before slowly rising from his chair. The fire crackled softly, a few sparks drifting upward into the chimney. He added another small peat brick, not enough to brighten the room, just enough to keep the warmth steady through the night. He moved to the window, hands in his pockets, and looked out at the village. The drizzle blurred the lights from a few distant cottages, making them glow softly like lanterns behind frosted glass. Patel's shop was dark. The hotel windows flickered faintly where guests settled into their rooms. The kirk stood still and quiet, rain slipping down its old stone walls. Lochdubh looked peaceful, subdued but at peace. He let his breath fog the glass slightly, then wiped it away with the side of his hand. All around him, the village seemed to breathe slowly again after days of tension. Folk were inside now, fires lit, doors closed against the soft rain. Life was returning to its gentle pattern. Hamish stepped away from the window and lowered himself back into his chair. The paperwork could wait until morning, so could Daviot's questions and Blair's inevitable boasting. Tonight was for quiet. Tonight was for allowing the ache to settle without sharpening it. He picked up his tea again, though it was stone cold by now. Lugs shifted, resting his head on Hamish's boot. The fire dimmed a fraction, settling low, content. Hamish closed his eyes briefly, just long enough to let the weight of the day slip from his shoulders. When he opened them again, the drizzle at the window had softened further, falling now like a gentle whisper on the glass. Outside, Lochdubh slept. Inside, Hamish sat steady, a lone figure beside a small fire, his dog at his feet. The quiet of the Highlands wrapping itself around him the way it always did, soft, melancholic, familiar. He reached down once more to stroke Lugs's head. The dog thumped his tail in lazy approval. "Tomorrow, boy," Hamish said softly. "We start fresh." Lugs breathed out a long, slow sigh, and Hamish let the night settle fully, wrapped in mist, memory, and the quiet comfort of a village that endured.